You have constructed narrative about the avoidant that transforms their defended limitations into attractive qualities, that reframes their inability to show up adequately as evidence of depth or complexity, that positions their emotional unavailability as challenge. You are uniquely qualified to overcome through your patience and understanding. You tell yourself that their withdrawal reflects their deep feelings that overwhelm them, that their inability to commit stems from past wounds that your love can heal, that their hot and cold behavior indicates internal struggle between their fear and their genuine care for you. You interpret their defended patterns through romantic lens that makes their inadequacy feel like destiny, that transforms dysfunction into narrative where you are the special person who can reach them, who can create safety where they finally lower their defenses, who can love them into wholeness through sustained presence, despite their patterns, consistently demonstrating they lack current capacity to reciprocate your investment adequately. This romanticization serves crucial psychological function. It allows you to maintain hope when evidence suggests hopelessness, permits you to continue investing when rational assessment would recommend withdrawal, enables you to frame their harmful patterns as temporary obstacles rather than as fundamental incompatibility between their demonstrated capacity and your legitimate needs. The romantic narrative protects you from facing painful truths, that their patterns harm you regardless of their underlying wounds, that their emotional unavailability is not mysterious depth but rather is defended limitation that prevents genuine intimacy, that their inability to meet your needs reflects their actual incapacity rather than temporary struggle they will overcome with sufficient time and patience from you. Yet this protective romanticization costs you substantially. It keeps you trapped in relationship that cannot meet your needs, prevents you from making clear-eyed decisions about whether continuing serves your well-being, maintains you in pattern of accommodating their limitations while your own needs remain perpetually unmet, blocks you from moving forward toward partnership with someone whose actual demonstrated capacity matches your needs, rather than someone whose potential you must constantly hope will eventually materialize. The truth that sets you free emerges through dismantling the romantic narratives you have constructed about the avoidant, through seeing their patterns clearly without the softening filter of romanticization, through recognizing that what you have characterized as depth or complexity or tragic struggle is actually defended dysfunction that harms you regardless of its origins or its underlying emotional reality for them. This truth feels harsh because it requires releasing the beautiful story you have told yourself about your connection, about your unique ability to reach them, about love conquering their defended limitations if you remain patient enough. Yet this harsh truth provides the foundation for your freedom. Freedom to stop sacrificing yourself for potential that may never materialize. Freedom to redirect your love towards someone capable of receiving and reciprocating it adequately. Freedom to build partnership based on demonstrated capacity rather than on romanticized potential. Freedom to choose yourself rather than continuing to choose hope that evidence suggests is misplaced. You've mistaken their emotional unavailability for depth and mystery. You have interpreted the avoidant's defended emotional opacity as evidence of profound inner complexity, have characterized their inability or unwillingness to share their feelings as mysterious depth that makes them more intriguing than people who communicate openly about their internal experience, the avoidant's silence about their emotions, their vague responses when you ask how they feel, their tendency to deflect or minimize when conversations turn toward vulnerable territory. All these patterns that reflect their defended limitations to engage emotionally have been reframed in your perception as indicators that they possess rich internal world that exists beneath surface presentation, that they feel things deeply but struggle to express those feelings, that their emotional unavailability signals intensity of feeling rather than absence or avoidance of feeling. This reframing transforms their dysfunction into attractive quality that draws you in rather than warning sign that should motivate your boundaries. The romanticization of their emotional unavailability as depth serves to make their patterns feel special rather than recognizing these patterns as common defended limitations that many avoidants share. You tell yourself that their particular way of being emotionally unavailable reflects their unique complexity, their specific wounds, their individual struggle with vulnerability. Yet the avoidant's emotional unavailability typically follows predictable patterns that reflect defended structure rather than unique depth. They share feelings in controlled doses that maintain their defended position, They withdraw when emotions intensify beyond comfortable threshold. They deflect vulnerable conversations through intellectualization or through changing subject. They minimize both their own emotions and yours to avoid discomfort that emotional intensity creates. These patterns are not mysterious or complex. They are defensive strategies that protect the avoidant from vulnerability while preventing the emotional intimacy that genuine partnership requires. The interpretation of emotional unavailability as depth also allows you to position yourself as a special person uniquely capable of accessing their hidden emotional world. You believe that beneath their defended exterior exists profound emotional landscape that they share with no one else, but that your patience and understanding will eventually unlock. This narrative makes you feel chosen, special, important. You are the one person who sees beneath their defenses, who understands their complexity, who will eventually be granted access to emotional depths they share with no one else. Yet this narrative often reflects more fantasy than reality. The avoidant's emotional unavailability typically extends across all their intimate relationships, not just with you. Their defended patterns prevent emotional depth with everyone, not just with most people, while reserving emotional intimacy for special someone who earns it. You are not uniquely positioned to access depths that exist beneath their defenses. You are experiencing the same emotional unavailability that anyone attempting intimate relationship with them would encounter. The romanticization particularly distorts your perception by making you interpret absence as presence, by seeing depth in what is actually vacancy. The avoidant provides minimal emotional sharing, and you interpret their minimal offerings as tip of massive emotional iceberg that exists below surface. The avoidant remains vague about their feelings, and you interpret their vagueness as protective mystery rather than as defended avoidance or possible actual lack of clarity about what they feel. The avoidant withdraws when emotions intensify, and you interpret their withdrawal as evidence they feel so much they must retreat, rather than recognizing withdrawal as defended strategy to avoid feeling or expressing emotion that exceeds their comfortable threshold. You are essentially filling in vast blanks with your projections of what you imagine exists within them, rather than accepting that the defended surface presentation may reflect most of what is actually available. The mistake of interpreting emotional unavailability as depth also prevents you from recognizing that emotional availability itself represents profound capacity that the avoidant lacks. You have devalued people who can communicate openly about their feelings, who can engage in vulnerable emotional conversations, who can share their internal experience without defensive opacity. You have characterized these emotionally available people as somehow less deep or less interesting than the avoidant whose defended limitations you have romanticized. Yet, emotional availability requires substantial psychological capacity. The ability to identify and articulate feelings, the courage to be vulnerable about internal experience, the skill to engage in emotional intimacy without defensive retreat. People who possess emotional availability are not simpler or less deep than defended people. They have developed capacities for intimacy that defended people lack. Your romanticization has inverted reality, making you value defended limitation as if it were superior capacity, while dismissing actual emotional capacity as if it were inferior simplicity. The romanticization of emotional unavailability as depth also serves to explain and justify your continued investment in relationship that does not meet your needs. If the avoidant's emotional unavailability reflects mysterious depth rather than defended limitation, then your patience waiting for them to open up feels like investment in discovering profound emotional riches rather than wasted time accommodating dysfunction. If their patterns reflect complexity rather than incapacity, then your struggle to connect with them emotionally feels like worthwhile challenge rather than futile attempt to get blood from stone. The romantic interpretation allows you to maintain that continuing to invest makes sense because the depth you imagine exists within them justifies the patience and effort required to access it. Understanding that you have mistaken emotional unavailability for depth requires accepting several uncomfortable truths. The avoidant's defended opacity reflects limitation rather than hidden richness. Their inability to share feelings stems from lack of capacity or willingness rather than from excess of feeling. Their patterns are common defended dysfunction rather than unique complexity. The emotional depths you imagine exist beneath their defended surface may not exist at all. What you see may be what you get, with no hidden emotional landscape waiting to be discovered if only you remain patient enough. Emotional availability represents advanced capacity that you should value rather than defended unavailability that you have romanticized. Your interpretation of their patterns as depth has served to keep you invested in relationship with someone who cannot provide emotional intimacy you need, while preventing you from recognizing that their defended patterns are not attractive mystery, but rather are dysfunction that makes genuine intimate partnership impossible, regardless of how you choose to interpret those patterns. Their struggle with intimacy isn't romantic. It's a pattern that harms you repeatedly. You have poeticized the avoidant's inability to sustain intimacy, have characterized their push-pull dynamic as evidence of passionate internal conflict, have framed their pattern of pursuing you when you withdraw, and withdrawing when you pursue as romantic dance, rather than recognizing this pattern as defended dysfunction that creates sustained insecurity and suffering for you. You tell yourself that their struggle with intimacy reflects how deeply they care about you, that they feel so much they must retreat, that closeness overwhelms them because the connection is so profound, that their fear of losing you generates their withdrawal because you matter so intensely to them. This romantic interpretation transforms their harmful patterns into evidence of deep feeling, making their inability to show up consistently feel like proof of significance rather than demonstration of incapacity. The romanticization of their intimacy struggles particularly manifests in how you interpret their withdrawal after periods of closeness. When the avoidant pulls away after you have shared vulnerable moment, after you have spent meaningful time together, after connection has deepened toward greater intimacy, you interpret their withdrawal as evidence that the intimacy affected them profoundly, that they need space to process intense feelings the closeness generated, that their retreat indicates how much the connection matters, rather than reflecting their defended discomfort with vulnerability. Yet this interpretation inverts the actual dynamics. The avoidant withdraws not because intimacy affected them so deeply they must retreat to process their feelings, but rather because intimacy exceeded their comfortable threshold and activated their defenses that protect them from vulnerability they experience as threatening. The withdrawal serves their defended comfort rather than serving deep feeling. It allows them to regulate their anxiety about closeness by creating distance that restores their sense of autonomy and control. You have also romanticized the avoidant's return after withdrawal, interpreting their cycle of leaving and coming back as evidence of bond that pulls them back despite their fear, as demonstration that connection between you is powerful enough to overcome their defended resistance. You see their return as romantic gesture that proves they cannot stay away, that they miss you too much to maintain the distance, that the relationship is strong enough to survive their patterns. Yet the return typically reflects not the pull of profound bond, but rather the avoidance attachment system activating when distance becomes too great or when they fear losing you permanently. The avoidant returns not because intimate bond draws them back, but because their nervous system cannot tolerate complete disconnection, because they have become dependent on your presence in ways they cannot acknowledge, because losing you would mean losing the comfort and stability your accommodating presence provides their defended position. The romanticization prevents you from recognizing that the avoidance intimacy struggles create real measurable harm to your well-being, regardless of their underlying causes or their emotional reality for the avoidant. The push-pull dynamic generates sustained anxiety in you about the relationship's status, about whether they will withdraw again, about whether increased closeness will trigger their next retreat. You exist in state of hypervigilance where you monitor their emotional temperature, where you attempt to predict and prevent their withdrawal, where you can never fully relax into security because their patterns have taught you that closeness precedes distance. This chronic anxiety affects your sleep, your concentration, your ability to be present in other areas of your life. Yet you have characterized this suffering as evidence of passionate connection rather than recognizing it as harm that dysfunctional relationship is causing you. The harm also manifests through the avoidance patterns, training you to suppress your authentic needs and your emotional expression to avoid triggering their withdrawal. You learn to minimize your own needs, because expressing needs might activate their sense of being pressured. You learn to regulate your emotional expression because showing emotion might overwhelm them. You learn to accept less than you need because requesting more might trigger their retreat. You learn to make yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding to maintain relationship with someone whose intimacy tolerance is so limited that your authentic full presence threatens their defended comfort. This learned self-suppression represents profound harm that accumulates across time. You are losing connection with your authentic self, losing capacity to express your needs, losing sense that your feelings and your requirements matter and deserve expression rather than suppression to accommodate someone else's defended limitations. The romanticization also prevents you from recognizing that the avoidance intimacy struggles are not temporary phase. They will outgrow or heal with sufficient time and patience, but rather are entrenched patterns that will continue indefinitely without genuine therapeutic intervention. You believe that your sustained presence will eventually create enough safety that their intimacy struggles will resolve, that your patience will be rewarded with their capacity, developing sufficiently to sustain consistent closeness. Yet the avoidance patterns typically do not resolve simply through time or through partners' understanding. They require the avoidant doing active therapeutic work on their defensive structure, examining their attachment wounds, developing different ways of managing their anxiety about vulnerability. Without this work, the patterns continue repeating, regardless of how patient you are or how safe you attempt to make the relationship for them. The characterization of their struggles as romantic also obscures recognition that many people exist who do not struggle with intimacy in ways that harm their partners, who can sustain closeness without defensive retreat, who can manage vulnerability without push-pull patterns. You have accepted the avoidance intimacy struggles as if they are normal or inevitable cost of deep connection, as if anyone truly worth loving would necessarily struggle with intimacy in ways that create suffering for you. Yet this acceptance represents distortion. Many people possess developed capacity for intimacy that allows them to sustain consistent closeness without defensive withdrawal, to increase vulnerability over time without retreating, to manage their own anxiety about intimacy without creating insecurity for their partners. These people are not less deep or less worth loving. They have developed capacities the avoidant lacks, capacities that would allow you to build secure relationship rather than romanticizing dysfunction. Understanding that the avoidant struggle with intimacy is not romantic requires accepting that these patterns harm you regardless of their underlying causes, that your suffering is not evidence of deep connection, but rather is consequence of dysfunctional relationship dynamics, that the push-pull cycle creates insecurity rather than passion, that their inability to sustain closeness reflects limitation rather than depth of feeling. The struggle is not romantic narrative of fear and love in conflict. It is defended pattern that prevents genuine intimacy while creating sustained suffering for you as you attempt to maintain relationship with someone whose defensive structure prevents them from meeting basic intimacy requirements that healthy partnership demands. Your romanticization has transformed harm into evidence of significance, has made suffering feel meaningful rather than recognizing suffering as signal. You should disengage from relationship that cannot meet your needs, regardless of how poetically you characterize the dysfunction. You've become addicted to the intermittent reinforcement, not to them. You have interpreted the intense feelings you experience in relationship with the avoidant as evidence of profound love or deep connection, have characterized the preoccupation and the anxiety as indicators that this relationship matters more than previous relationships where you felt more secure and less obsessed. Yet the intensity you experience reflects not the depth of genuine love, but rather the effects of intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning that exists, the pattern that creates addiction-like psychological states, where you become hooked on pursuing unpredictable reward rather than being genuinely bonded to a specific person providing that reward. You are addicted to the push-pull dynamic, to the uncertainty, to the intermittent moments of closeness that feel intensely rewarding precisely because they are unpredictable and surrounded by periods of withdrawal. This addiction to the pattern feels like deep love because addiction and love activate similar neural pathways and create similar subjective experiences of preoccupation and longing. Yet addiction and love are fundamentally different, and mistaking addiction for love keeps you trapped in harmful dynamic while believing you are experiencing profound connection. The intermittent reinforcement operates through the avoidant's unpredictable pattern of availability and withdrawal. The avoidant is not consistently unavailable. If they were, you would grieve and move on. The avoidant is not consistently available. If they were, you would feel secure and the relationship would lack the intense quality you have mistaken for passion. Instead, the avoidant provides sporadic availability, occasional moments of genuine connection, unpredictable periods where they are emotionally present before retreating into defended distance. This intermittent pattern creates far more powerful conditioning than consistent reward or consistent absence, because your nervous system becomes focused on predicting and obtaining the unpredictable positive reinforcement, generating sustained state of vigilant pursuit where you are constantly trying to earn or secure their availability. The addiction manifests through the intense high you experience when the avoidant is available and engaged. After a period of their withdrawal or defended distance, when the avoidant returns or shows increased presence, you experience a flood of relief and euphoria that feels like evidence of deep love. Yet this intense positive feeling reflects not the joy of genuine secure love, but rather the relief of anxiety resolution. Your nervous system has been in activated state during their withdrawal, and their return provides relief from that activation that your brain processes as intensely positive. The contrast between the distress of their withdrawal and the relief of their return makes their presence feel more rewarding than it objectively is, creating intensity that you mistake for depth of connection rather than recognizing as effect of the push-pull dynamic on your nervous system. The addiction also manifests through the obsessive quality of your thoughts about the avoidant and about the relationship. You think about them constantly, analyze their behavior obsessively, attempt to predict their patterns, work to understand their psychology in ways that might allow you to secure their consistent availability. This preoccupation feels like evidence that you love them deeply, that they are the most important person in your life. Yet this obsessive quality more closely resembles addiction than love. Secure love allows you to maintain other life areas and relationships without constant preoccupation, allows you to be present for your own life rather than being consumed with monitoring another person's emotional state and availability. The obsessive preoccupation indicates not depth of love, but rather nervous system's activation by intermittent reinforcement that keeps you in constant state of pursuing unpredictable reward. The intermittent reinforcement addiction also explains why you feel more intensely about the avoidant than you felt about previous partners who were more consistently available. You interpret the intensity as evidence that this relationship is more significant, that the avoidant is more compatible or more right for you than previous partners were. Yet the intensity reflects the effects of intermittent reinforcement rather than compatibility or rightness. Previous partners who were consistently available did not activate the addiction pathways because their consistent presence meant your nervous system could relax rather than remaining in constant state of pursuit. The avoidant's intermittent availability creates the intensity, the preoccupation, the sense that this relationship matters more. Not because the relationship is actually better or deeper, but because the pattern activates addiction dynamics that consistent, secure love does not trigger. The addiction keeps you trapped because intermittent reinforcement is notoriously difficult to extinguish. The unpredictability of reward makes you more persistent in pursuing it because your nervous system maintains hope that the next attempt will succeed, that the next interaction will provide the consistent availability you seek. When the avoidant withdraws, you do not disengage. Instead, you increase your efforts to restore their availability, believing that trying harder or approaching differently will secure the consistent connection that intermittent pattern prevents. This increased effort when reward becomes unavailable reflects classic addiction pattern, yet you interpret your persistence as evidence of deep love, rather than recognizing it as effect of intermittent reinforcement, keeping you hooked in pursuit of unpredictable reward. Understanding that you are addicted to intermittent reinforcement rather than genuinely bonded to the avoidant requires distinguishing between intensity and depth, between preoccupation and genuine love, between addiction dynamics and secure attachment. Genuine love creates peace alongside the care, allows you to maintain balanced life, does not require constant vigilance or obsessive focus on another person's availability. Genuine secure attachment allows you to be present for your own life while trusting in relationships' stability rather than consuming all your energy monitoring whether partner will withdraw. The intensity you feel with the avoidant reflects activated nervous system responding to intermittent reinforcement, not the depth of secure mutual love. Your preoccupation indicates addiction to pattern rather than deep bond to person. The difficulty leaving despite recognizing the relationship does not meet your needs, reflects not deep love worth fighting for, but rather addiction dynamics that make disengagement difficult, even when rational assessment indicates disengagement serves your well-being. Recognizing this truth, that you are addicted to the pattern rather than deeply bonded to the person, allows you to understand why the relationship feels so compelling despite being so harmful, why you cannot seem to leave despite knowing you should, why you feel more intensely about this dysfunctional relationship than you felt about previous healthier relationships. The intensity is not evidence that this relationship is special or worth preserving. The intensity is evidence of intermittent reinforcement, creating addiction dynamics that your romantic interpretation has mistaken for deep love. Freeing yourself requires recognizing the addiction, understanding that the compelling feelings reflect conditioning rather than genuine bond, accepting that the relationship's intensity indicates dysfunction rather than depth, allowing yourself to disengage from pattern that has hijacked your nervous system while framing that hijacking as evidence of profound connection worth sacrificing your well-being to maintain. The right person narrative keeps you trapped in waiting for transformation. You have adopted narrative that positions you as the right person who can help the avoidant heal, who can create sufficient safety for them to lower their defenses, who can love them in ways that will eventually allow them to overcome their patterns and to show up adequately in relationship. This narrative serves crucial function in maintaining your investment, despite accumulating evidence that the avoidant lacks current capacity to meet your needs. The right person framework allows you to believe that their inadequacy is not permanent limitation, but rather is temporary protection that will dissolve once you prove yourself to be the safe person they can trust. You interpret every small gesture of vulnerability as evidence that your rightness for them is working, that you are gradually earning their trust, that sustained patience will eventually be rewarded with their transformation into partner who can meet your needs consistently. The right person narrative operates through belief that love itself is transformative force, sufficient to overcome defended patterns, that if you love the avoidant adequately and patiently enough, that love will heal their wounds and will enable them to develop capacity they currently lack. This narrative romanticizes love as magical force that transcends psychological reality, suggesting that the power of being loved by right person can undo years of defensive conditioning and attachment wounding without requiring the defended person to do active intentional therapeutic work on their patterns. Yet this narrative misrepresents how psychological change actually occurs. Love alone does not heal attachment wounds or transform defended patterns. Love can provide supportive context where a person feels safe enough to do healing work. But the healing itself requires the wounded person actively engaging in therapeutic process, examining their patterns, developing insight about their defenses, practicing different ways of relating. Your love cannot do this work for them, regardless of how right you are for them or how patient you remain.